Hello, my lovely. We left off at a very bad place. The brother just killed his brother, right? Let's find out what happens after that. So then one day, Gramercy was found dead in the garden, an axe in his back. Actually, it doesn't say the brother killed him, but I'm assuming. Uncle Maelstrom paused for effect. Vial was never arrested and never tried, but he killed his brother, Gramercy. As sure as the sky is blue, as sure as the water's wet, and as sure as I'm standing here. Shenanigan always got the shivers at that bit. There were portraits of Vial in the house still. One large painting in the hall showed Mazard with his 3 children standing in the shade of a huge oak tree that had once dominated the front lawn. Shenanigan had stared at the young Vial's face for hours, trying to see the murderer in it. Gramercy had left some money for his wife and daughter, but with no other male heir, for which in those days was important for some reason, everything else went to Vial, including his own half of the house. Vial's wealth grew and grew. He became a merchant, then a gentleman, then a lord. He married off his niece as quickly as he could and sent her husband abroad. He built the monument to himself in the garden, supposedly right on the spot where he murdered Gramercy. But Vial's fear grew with his wealth. He became terrified of other members of the family, and especially terrified that one of them would come along and rob him, the way he had robbed his brother. He withdrew all of his funds from the bank, and with it he bought gold, silver, jewels, all the riches he could get his hands on. He amassed a dragon's hoard of wealth, and like a dragon lived atop it. Because he never left the Swift estate again. He shut himself away, admitted no visitors, and communicated only by letter. When he finally died, it was a week before anyone dared to fetch his body. By which time he would have been squishy, added Shenanigan with morbid delight. His eyes would have collapsed inside his head, and he would have started to swell up, and the rats. Yes, all right, said Aunt Inheritance queasily. I don't think we need to be that gleeful about the death of a relative. When poor Cantrip learned of her brother's deaths, her grief was terrible. She returned to England and the house she had inherited. Vial's actions had divided and scattered the family, but Cantrip was wise. To draw them together again, she invited every living Swift to come to the house and hunt for the missing fortune. This was the first reunion, and she the first matriarch. And the treasure? Prompted Shenanigan. The family searched high and low that reunion, and every reunion thereafter, recited Maelstrom, building his own final flourish. But no trace of Vial's hoard has ever been found. Maelstrom paused until the silence rang. Then he clapped his hands, and Inheritance jumped. And so the story's ended. Well told, beamed Inheritance. Seemingly unable to help herself, she added, though of course it's no substitute for the play Cantrip herself wrote, The Tragical Tale of Gramercy and Vial. Cousin Thespian is going to perform it on Saturday. And then the play isn't nearly as thrilling as the family's old housekeeping books and tax records. As Inheritance began a lecture on the bookkeeping of centuries past, Shenanigan slid off Uncle Maelstrom's shoulders and slipped away through a passage behind a suit of armor. For Shenanigan had a secret project. A year ago, Shenanigan had begun her map. It was a bold attempt to mark down every concealed nook, every hidden pathway, every hiding spot in the house. Most people would have said it was impossible. But Shenanigan wasn't most people. She had just the mix of stubbornness and curiosity that either rediscovered lost cities or landed a person in jail. Learning new escape routes had proved useful, really, but really she was just looking for the lost Swift fortune. Vile's hoard, hidden somewhere on this estate by Grand Uncle Vile himself. Shenanigan had plans for that treasure. They changed and shifted according to her mood, but always involved adventure. If one of her relatives turned up and found it before her, she was sure she would burst into flames of jealousy and die on the spot. So, this map is pretty darn complicated. She's even got a key down here, right? Stairs to, oh no, the key's up here. What things mean, right? Sometimes we call that a legend. And then all the numbers are the stairs to places. But look at all the levels. I'm sure you're going to spend some time looking at that. That's pretty cool. John the cat sauntered past, carrying a dead moth the size of a pigeon. Shenanigan idly scratched him behind the ears. She had already marked down most of the hidden rooms and passages, and now her focus was on suspicious paintings. In mystery stories, the secret wall safe or old treasure map was usually found behind the strangest, ugliest painting in the room. And since detective novels were some of the only books in the library not booby-trapped, they were far too popular, many Swifts had copied this idea when creating their own hiding place. The result was a house full of bad art. On the back of the map, Shenanigan had listed her discoveries as she worked her way down through the house. Suspicious paintings on the second floor. Coral bedroom. Pond scum. Watercolor. Wall safe. Broken lock. Empty. A clown's lament, his lot in life. Oil on canvas. Nothing. Sardine cannery at sunset. Oil on wood. Loose brick contains old diary. Boring. Monkey on a rocking horse. Pencil sketch. Peephole into adjoining bathroom. Bathroom. A sea on a drizzly day. Pastels. Nothing. Mermaid eating a hot dog. Watercolor. Peephole into the adjoining bedroom. Second floor corridor. Still life of a bowl of pistachios. Pastels. One red button. Do not press. The sour-faced Duchess. Oil on canvas. Wall safe. Left open. Contains moldy remains of a sandwich. A study in ink. Ink on paper. Message in what looks like red paint. Illegible. Nun picking her nose. Oil on canvas. Laundry chute. So, nothing unusual yet. Shenanigan leaned back against the wall, fished half a browning apple from the depth of her pocket, and considered her next move. On the floor below, she could hear Felicity trilling a song in French as she dusted. On the ground floor, Cook was calling out items to Phenomena as she prepared to do a last-minute grocery run. If Shenanigan hurried, she could make a start on the chartreuse room before anyone noticed she was missing. She threw her apple core down the laundry chute behind Nun picking her nose. Her hands were sticky, so she quickly wiped them on the wallpaper in the alcove above her, and paused. Instead of wallpaper, Shenanigan felt the cool, slightly bumpy surface of oil paint on canvas. She took a closer look. The alcove, she realized, wasn't an alcove at all, but an enormous floor-to-ceiling canvas painted to look exactly like an empty stretch of corridor. A slim crack ran around the edges where the painting had been set into the wall. She would never even have noticed if she hadn't rubbed her hands all over it. Shenanigan's heart thudded. She dug the tips of her fingers into the tiny seam around the edges of the canvas, wishing for a brief moment that she had Felicity's nails. To her surprise, the painting swung outward easily, perfectly balanced on slim hinges. Behind the painting, there was a door. Shenanigan had been counting coins in her head before she had even pulled back the painting, so it was a crushing blow to realize that the door had no handle or visible lock, only a tiny round hole at the eye level, little more than the width of a toothpick. Like all decent explorers, Shenanigan carried a Swiss Army knife, and like all good escape artists, she also carried several paper clips to use as lockpicks. But although she picked and plied for several minutes, she could not get the door to open. Whoever had built the lock had made it impenetrable to children, which is no mean feat. Shenanigan may not have been able to get in, but this didn't mean she couldn't find anything out. First, she thumped hard on the door. Then she sprawled flat on the carpet and pressed her nose to the crack between the door and the floor and sniffed mightily. After that, she pulled a mirror out of her pack and angled it just so beneath the door frame. She now knew several things. Judging by the echo when she hit the door, the room was of decent size. The air within was cool and dry and smelled like old books. The mirror had reflected only darkness, which told her there was probably no window. Detective novels, the safest books in the library. Shenanigan sat back and considered her next move. When you are faced with a problem, it can be very difficult to admit that doing nothing might be just as good as doing something. Shenanigan was a doing something person, and walking away and leaving the door felt like a defeat. Better to think of this not as walking away, she decided, but as regrouping for a second attack. Shenanigan took out her pen. To her list of suspicious paintings, she added floor-length canvas, camouflaged, oil on canvas, secret room? ? Then she drew a large red question mark on the second floor corridor, on the spot where the map told her there should be nothing but a blank stretch of wall. Let's begin chapter 4. It's called A Research Proposal. Dinner that night was a humble affair. Aunt Schadenfreude had chosen to eat in her room, and Maelstrom took to his bed early. He had run afoul of the stuffed deer in the taxidermy hall and had been lightly gored by some falling antlers. The black skin of his hands and arms, already richly dotted with scars from a lifetime of sailing mishaps, bore several brand new cuts. Shenanigan, who had no scars at all, was terribly jealous. The remaining family members drooped around the kitchen table, exhausted from cleaning. Tragically, Inheritance wasn't in the least worn out. She sat steadily chewing on bits of family history and steadily chattering over a single slice of bread. Shenanigan took the seat next to her with all the enthusiasm of a prisoner going to the guillotine. Cook gave her a sympathetic wink over her aunt's eye and mimed knocking her out with a ladle. Shenanigan, hands, wash your hands first, and buck up. You, girl, have such long faces. You remind me of my first horse. Cook set a plate in front of Shenanigan and slipped her an extra chunk of garlic bread. Rasputin was his name. Great big roan stallion, miserable as sin. Felicity, you look so like him, I almost fed you a lump of sugar. Shenanigan had known Cook her whole life, and for a long time thought she was a distant cousin of some sort. It had been a great shock to learn that Cook was not Cook's given name, and that she wasn't a Swift at all, but something called a Winifred. At first, Shenanigan found this a great betrayal, and refused to eat anything made by the hands of a traitor. But after a week of living off hoarded biscuits and unripe fruits foraged from the orchard, Shenanigan had rearranged some things in her brain and realized that Cook was not a traitor at all, but a great hero. Cook, Winifred, had not been born a Swift, yet had come among them, taken a proper Swift name, and become a Swift choice. Cook rarely talked about her life before she had come to live at the house, saying only that she had run away from home. Ruddy-cheeked and hard-jawed, she always spoke as if there was a marble in her mouth, and she was trying desperately not to swallow. She told Shenanigan she had something called electrocution lessons. It's actually elocution lessons, but it's written electrocution lessons as a child, and that is why she sounded so posh. Shenanigan thought it was pretty terrible to electrocute someone just to make them speak differently, and reasoned that was probably why Cook had run away. Cook was family, even if she wasn't family, and everyone in the house understood this. Everyone, it seemed, except Aunt Inheritance, who was unable to grasp that Cook didn't work for them. Cook, for breakfast tomorrow, I would like 2 boiled eggs, nice and runny, said Inheritance. Would you? Said Cook mildly. Then we must show you how to work the stove. It can be a bit temperamental. A moment later, Inheritance noted, The reunion must be a lot of work for you, Cook. Are you sure you can keep up? It's very kind of you to worry, but we are more than capable. Cook gestured to the bowls, trays, and pots crammed on the table counter, the first line of defense against the family's appetites. One's mettle is tested in times of trial. That's what I always say. And finally, as the girls were clearing away the plates, Inheritance rubbed at a smear on her glass and said, It does seem rather odd to have a house this size and only 1 employee. The jar Cook was trying to open cracked in her hands. An employee? She glanced around in marked surprise. I didn't know we hired anyone. Shenanigan got the feeling that conversations like this occurred at every reunion. She also got the feeling she'd like to borrow Cook's ladle. As the girls picked their way through dessert, Aunt Inheritance finally seemed to steel herself. Girls, she folded her hands on the table, I can't help but feeling that you are not treating the reunion with the excitement it deserves. The girls looked at her blankly. Perhaps, Inheritance tried again, your aunt has failed to impress upon you its importance to the family. Shenanigan opened her mouth to say that of course she knew it was important. There was a massive pile of gold at stake. But Felicity jumped in. It's not that we don't want to see our relatives, she said tactfully. At 14, she was the only one able to recall the last reunion. She told her sisters that it was like being cornered by 100 instruments all playing out of tune. It's just that there's a lot of them. We'd rather they visit in shifts. Or formed an orderly queue, added Phenomena. Aunt Inheritance's watery eyes had that manic shine to them again. Our family must be maybe a little chaotic. You have heard the story. Our coming here to this house is tradition. Tradition, girls, is a living thing, a flame passed from the past to the future. It is our job to keep it alive. We must take pride in our history, in the honor of our forebears. Why, some of them weren't particularly honorable, pointed out Shenanigan. Well, yes, there were a few bad apples, but you should know, Shenanigan, the Swifts aren't normal people. The rules don't apply to us in the same way. Cook snorted. Good Lord, it's like I never left the palace, she muttered. As a family, we are blessed, continued Aunt Inheritance. Normal people go their whole lives trying to find themselves. Once we are named, we know ourselves, our roles from birth to death. Good or bad, we just are. The dictionary guides us. She looked beadily at Shenanigan. Don't you find it a comfort to know exactly what you are? Shenanigan's stomach lurched, though if you'd asked her why, she wouldn't have been able to say. Aunt Schadenfreude's words came back to her again. You can't help your name. All right. Let's stop there at the very top of page 36. I like hearing about this family. It gets more interesting as we go. I'm curious to find out if they're going to find the treasure and what the treasure is. But we're only at the beginning. We've got lots to go. All right, my lovely. Birthday kisses until we read again. I love you.